Is it my turn to start, or is there anything else going on?
No, I think we are ready to start. I haven't even given them a lot of context except to tell them that you are a second generation Holocaust survivor. I'm sure you're going to get into all of that.
Yep.
I got to meet Heidi through my work with the Vermont Holocaust Memorial, and she has been in my classroom visiting before as well. And she has written this novel that we'll talk more about called Tutti's Promise. I linked the information from our Vermont Holocaust Memorial website to our Schoology page, so you can access this afterwards. You can look back at Heidi's family story as well from that page. And I will actually, you have a website for just your book too, and I'll link that there today too.
Okay.
So that we can have
that.
Because
on my website, there's actually, there's more of the primary source documents and videos of my mom talking about her experience and pictures, and there's all kinds of information there that they might want to look at.
Excellent, great. Well, thank you, Heidi. We're so excited to have you here today, and my students on Thursday will be watching this presentation. So we'll have two different groups of kids who get to see this. So thanks for being with us all the way from Connecticut today, right?
I am actually in Connecticut today. I live in Vermont. I live in Norwich, but I'm in Connecticut for the weekend and through today. And Tutti, where you see the picture of her on the book here, that's my mom, and she survived the Holocaust. So I am going to tell you her story. So she was born 1935. Her name was Ruth Lichtenstern, but everybody called her Tutti. And here's a picture of her with her father, my grandfather, and her mother, my grandmother. And they were living in Germany. They considered themselves German before they considered themselves Jewish. And, life was okay. And then Hitler came along. So Germany took away their citizenship. They were stateless. And my grandfather knew things were going to be bad. My grandfather worked for a Jewish company, and the boss of that company decided to move the whole thing to Amsterdam in the Netherlands. And so my grandfather was able to move right with him and have a job. And the move to Amsterdam was fairly smooth. The only issue that happened was that my great grandfather, so Tutti's Margaret, my grandmother's father, tried to take all of his money with him when they went to Amsterdam. And the Nazis had imposed what they called a emigration tax, or you could also call it a flight tax, what people started calling it. And between 60 and 90% of everything you owned, you had to give to the Reich for the honor of leaving Germany. Not your income, it wasn't 60% of your income, it was 60% of everything you owned. And as the years went by, more and more money had to be given. And because my great-grandfather tried to take most of his money with him, he was thrown in jail for 6 months, but then they let him out, which was very lucky. Things were going okay in Holland. Like I said, my grandfather Heinz had a job. My uncle Robbie was born until 1940, when in 1940 the Germans invaded Holland, and you saw scenes like this. I don't know if you guys can figure out what this is. Anybody have a guess on what's going on in this picture? And I can't call on anybody, so.
Anybody know what's going on in that little picture down there?
Anybody know?
Can you see it? Let me zoom in a little bit, okay? Oh,
okay.
I can't because you have screen rights.
Oh, I don't know how to do it.
Like this, and there's somebody driving down the road here. What do you think's going on there?
Saluting Hitler.
Are they saluting Hitler? Is a guess?
Yep, the Dutch are welcoming the Nazis in by giving the Hitler salute as the Germans are rolling down the street into Amsterdam. Okay, so there are plenty of Dutch citizens welcoming them, so to speak. And you start getting things like this showing up in doors and windows. Jews are forbidden here. So life was starting to change. The first thing that the Nazis did was they started segregating the Jews from the other citizens of the Netherlands. So benches popped up. Jews could sit here, they couldn't sit over there. There was certain times that Jews could go shopping, which was always at the end of the day when the stores had less in them. There were, if you were needed to go to the doctor or the dentist or a lawyer, you could only go to a Jewish doctor or dentist or lawyer. You couldn't go to a non-Jew for professional services. There was a curfew set up. You had to be in your house by a certain time. If you owned a car or a radio or a bicycle, you had to register it with the authorities. And then later, a few months later, they'd say, oh yes, we're gonna confiscate those registered bikes and cars and radios. So you weren't allowed to have them anymore. It's really important to understand that the Nazis didn't come up with this idea of segregation. They were not the first people to do this. Anybody recognize any of these pictures? This is the United States Jim Crow time segregation. And Hitler based his ideas of segregation on what the US was doing first. So I just want you to keep that in mind when you learn about the Holocaust. This was not a new concept of treating certain people worse than other people, considering them not worthy and not wanting to have people mix with each other. Everybody in Amsterdam had to have an ID card. So this is Tutti's mother's ID card. Here she is in the corner. And if you were Jewish, you got the big J put on your card. So if anybody in authority asked you for your ID, immediately the first thing they would see is that this person's a Jew. It was very important for the Nazis. They wanted to know who was Jewish. And not just if you were Jewish, but what they considered how Jewish you were. A little bit like the United States did with Native Americans and Blacks during our history. How Native somebody was, how Black somebody was, if they were of mixed race. This is not, again, not new for the Nazis. And so on this ID card, which is also my grandmother's, has her name, her address, where she was born. This question down here, how many of your grandparents were Jewish? And if the answer is 4, fear means 4, that means you are a full Jew. If you only had 2 Jewish grandparents, you were half Jew and you were treated a little better at the beginning of all of this. Didn't last, but a little bit better. Here is my grandfather's ID card, Tutti's mother, Tutti's father. Same thing, the J, the 4 grandparents. And in 1942, they enacted the rule where all Jews had to wear the yellow star. So here we have the yellow star. This Yod means Jew in Dutch. And this is Tutti right here. This is her first grade class. And if you look carefully, every student has that star on their clothing because they were not allowed to go to the public school anymore. No public education would be allowed for the Jews. They had to go to a Jewish school that the Jewish community set up. And look how many students are in one class with one teacher. Now, I don't know about you, but if I had that many students in my first grade class with one teacher, I don't think I would have learned anything that year. Because how can one teacher keep track of all those kids? And then another thing to remember is the teachers, who were mostly young adults, were being deported. So you might have a teacher for a month or 2, and then that person gets taken away by the Nazis, and then somebody else is there to replace them. And they're being deported because the Nazis were using the young adults for slave labor. And they didn't want young adults who might fight back in the community. Those are the first people that they took out of communities. Let's see, What else? This is a map of Amsterdam. The green and blue part is an actual map from the time, road maps. And then this black and white section was a map that a civil servant that worked for the Dutch government made when the Nazis asked them to, where each of the dots represents a Jewish household. So the Dutch basically turned the Jews over and said, yep, this is where the Jews live. These are the Jewish neighborhoods. So when Tutti first moved to Amsterdam, her family lived in this neighborhood. And it was a very upscale neighborhood. It's in the museum district. It's near the concert hall. Apartments are big and spacious. Well, the Nazis wanted that house. They didn't want to let a Jewish family live there. So when they invaded, they forced the family in 1942 to move to this neighborhood over here, which is actually the same neighborhood that Anne Frank lived in. You see, there are a lot more Jews living over here. The Nazis were pushing people into the Jewish neighborhoods, which then became Jewish ghettos. And in 1943, the families moved to this neighborhood over here. All right, any ideas out there in the class why the Germans were doing that? Why were they moving them into these population centers?
What do you know? We went over this. Why were they moved into ghettos and population centers? The answer was to keep them all together.
Right, so why do they want to keep them all together?
So it's easier to move.
Easier to move with them, easier to keep track of them.
Yes, easier to move them, easier to keep track of them. What they were doing was they had something called razzias, where the Germans would show up with trucks and get people. So here we have our guest, our special guest. Tutti is sitting next to me, and she's going to tell you about a razzia that she saw when she was a little girl.
I was standing at the window. It had a gauze curtain.
This window right here.
And I was looking outside and I saw trucks coming, blowing their horns, and Germans came out. And I saw them knocking at the doors and saying in German, raus, raus, meaning get out, get out. And all these people living there were in a way prepared, and they had a rucksack, which is the same as a backpack, with all their essential stuff. I had whatever it is, my favorite toy, and my mother had the medications that we needed. So I saw people being herded out and into those trucks. And I was still a little girl, and I was holding a very fuzzy, very pink stuffed animal. And somebody, one of my parents' friends who were with us, came and pulled that stuffy out of my arms and said, "Are you nuts? This is very pink. If the Germans look up and see that, it draws attention and they will come to us too."
Okay, so you always wanted to blend in. You didn't want to stand out. You didn't want the Germans to notice you because you wanted them to just bypass you and go somewhere else, basically. Around that time, my grandfather received the notice that he was supposed to report with the family to the Nazis. He didn't want to do that, of course. And so now we start getting into the sneaky business of hiding. My grandfather gave Egbert de Jong, this man, all the extra money he had. He basically emptied his bank accounts and said, he gave it to Egbert, and he said, "You take care of my money." Remember that flight tax when they left Germany, how the Nazis took all the money from the family? Well, my grandfather assumed that would happen again. So he gave the money to Egbert, who he had worked with and was a good friend of his and was not Jewish, and said, "Take care of my money. You can keep it. They won't take it from you." And then Egbert, along with another friend of theirs, Bobby Klopfer, made the arrangement that the family could hide in Bobby's attic. And this is the room, the attic room that the family hid in. It wasn't like a New England attic where, with with the rafters and above the floorboards. This was more of a extra room on the top of the apartment building that at one point might have been a maid's quarters, but at this point was a storage room. And this is where they were. And they had to be very, very quiet when they had to be really, really quiet when they were in there, because the apartment below was not Bobby Klopfer's. He lived 2 floors below. Another family lived in between. And if you imagine this 5-year-old boy who you can see looks like a complete troublemaker, and he was a complete troublemaker, and this 7-year-old girl had to be quiet day in and day out so the family underneath wouldn't hear them. And the parents had to keep them quiet and had to keep them away from the window because they didn't need people across the street to see that there was a family living in this room, and they couldn't have lights on unless they had blackout curtains up. Well, at the same time, the Egbert, who had worked with my grandfather, was working in the background, and he managed to get his hands on fake papers for the family. They got a passport that said that they were from Paraguay. Okay, Paraguay is not part of this war. And I will get to the passport a little bit more, but my grandfather, when he got that passport, was like, oh, well, now we can turn ourselves into the Nazis because they won't hurt us because we are not stateless Jews. We are South American citizens. And we know the Nazis don't want to get South America mad at them now at this point in the war. That would be a really bad thing for the Nazis to do. And so my grandfather, Tutti's father, they turned themselves in because my grandfather thought that they would be able to be left alone. Well, it didn't quite work that way. They were then arrested and they were sent to this, what they called the Jewish theater. And I'm going to let Tutti tell you about what life was like when they were in the Jewish theater and what went on there.
There were many, many people crammed together. All the theater stuff, seats and props had been taken out. And there were terrible facilities for the bathroom. There was nothing to eat. And we were hundreds of people sitting, waiting for registration. My parents standing in line, and my brother and I sort of bewildered, sat on the floor, not knowing what's going on.
Okay. So that lasted for 3-4 days. Mom doesn't quite remember. And then they were sent here to Westerbork. This was a refugee camp built in Holland by the Dutch government when all the Germans were fleeing Germany at the beginning of Hitler's reign. If you didn't have a job, if you had nowhere to live, if you had nowhere to sponsor you, you were sent to a refugee camp. A little bit similar to refugee camps that this country has along its border. But then the Nazis came in and they were like, oh, well, here's a place where there's a bunch of Jews. They're already in barracks, and let's just put a fence around it. And they put the barbed wire fence up, and they put watchtowers up, and they crowded people into these barracks. And here's a map of the place. And this place was what they called a transit camp. It wasn't a concentration camp where people generally stayed for a long period of time. The trains came in from Amsterdam and other places in Holland. They stopped, they unloaded people, and then they lived there for maybe a week, maybe a month. When they had enough people, the trains came through, they left again, and they went what they called to the east. And this happened every Tuesday. Every Monday, there would be an announcement late at night who was going to be on the train leaving and being deported from the country. 2,000 people at a time, 3,000 people at a time, 1,000 people at a time. It just immense numbers. And the family was there living in these conditions for about a month. And when I was doing research on this, I found something out that Tutti didn't remember. After a month, she was released. Heinz, Margaret, Robert, and Ruth, remember Tutti is Ruth, were released on this particular day. And I asked my mom, I said, Mom, you were released. They let you out of the camp? and she had no memory of it because again, she was a little kid, and it was a things got a little gets mixed up after, you know, decades of trying to remember everything that happened. And I was trying to find out what happened, and this is where the story gets a little complicated. I'm going to try to do it as fast as I can. But what was going on was, remember Egbert? He was the Minister of Non-Ferrous Metals for the Netherlands, which meant he was in charge of all buying and selling of large quantities of metals in and out of the country. My grandfather was a metals commodities trader. And Egbert and, let me back up, Joseph Sachs, Leopold Oberlander, and Heinz Lichtenstern together were creating a situation where Westerbork was being turned into a work camp. Scrap metal from all over the country was being brought to the camp. Scrap metal, whether it was like from a town that gathered the scrap metal, like we do now at our local transfer stations, or an airplane that gets shot down. And it's brought to the camp, and the Jews were being put to work disassembling the metal and separating it into different bins. So the copper is here and the steel is there, and, you know, mixing it, taking it and separating it so that the Nazis could use it because they needed the metal for building tanks and planes and bullets and what have you. Here is a graph showing that at the end of 1943, they had started with 5 people working, and they built up to about 1,200 Jews working at the camp, separating scrap metal. And this is the Jews trying to save themselves. If they were working for the Nazis wouldn't kill them. So it's 1,200 people not being sent to the East, which they all knew was bad news. So the Lichtensterns and the Sachs and the Oberlanders are all sent back to Amsterdam. And I found these series of letters that went back and forth between 2 top Nazis. One of them was Albert Speer, who was in charge of all the armaments and metal. And the other was Adolf Eichmann. Sarah, do they know who Eichmann is?
We have not talked much about Eichmann at this point. No.
Okay, Eichmann was the man who was basically in charge of enacting the final solution. Eichmann's job was to get all the Jews from all over Europe rounded up and sent to the camps where they started killing people. And he was infamous, and you know, so these 2 top Nazis are arguing what to do with what they called the metal Jews. And on each of these letters, my grandfather's name, Tutti's father, is on them. And they were arguing what to do with these particular men. If you look closely here in the blue circles, this is in Hebrew, because these documents were found after the war. In 1960, Eichmann was captured in Argentina, and he was put on trial by the Israelis. And these pieces of paper were used to help convict him. And they had my grandfather's name on them, which to me is just like makes the hair stand up on my neck. It's too close to the reality. Oh, but after a few months, this is in order to arrest the Lichtenstern, Sachs, and Oberlander families again. Eichmann had had enough. He said, basically, he won the argument with Speer. Speer wanted these guys out of the camps. Eichmann wanted them back in the camps. Eichmann wins, and they're sent back to the camp. And if you look at this picture again, you can see all the scrap metal laying around. Here's just one particular pile of it. So they're in the camp, and now it's the summer of 1943, and Tutti's birthday comes along. I'm going to let, 44, we're 1944. All right, Tutti has a birthday, and she's going to tell you about her 9th birthday.
There were no stores, of course, in Westerbork. My father was allowed to go back to Amsterdam, back and forth under the auspices of the Nazis for the metals. So he had a chance to go to Amsterdam. And on one of those trips, he decided I'm quickly going to go to a store and buy Tutti a birthday present. And he came back with the picture of the doll. You see her. She was at this point quite beaten up, but she was pretty and new when I got her. My mother had baked a birthday cake from old potatoes, and we celebrated my birthday. And after we celebrated, my father said, Tutti, come here, I want to talk to you. And he said, you see the doll? The head is ceramic. I'm going to show you something. And he undid the ceramic head from the body, which was solid. And it was hollow. And he said, look, the money I have here, the jewels I have from your mother still, I'm putting in the doll's head. I'm putting the doll's head back. We make very sure that the head is back the right way. And it is your responsibility. Never, ever let go of that doll. That doll could mean we could bribe somebody. It could mean we could, after the war, start over again. You never know, but that doll is very special.
So that doll actually still exists, and she's in a museum here in Connecticut. It was really hard for me to get my mother to let go of the doll enough to bring it to the museum. She actually asked me quite a bit, is the doll okay? Is she still okay? So it's hard for her to let go. Soon after that birthday in September, the family was sent on to the next camp. They were put in one of these cattle cars. I'm sure you've seen other pictures of cattle cars and read about them. And this is one page of a transport list where you see the Lichtenstern family right here. But they were 2,000 people on this transport in the train. And they were all sent on to a camp called Theresienstadt or Terezin, which was in what had been the now is the Czech Republic, was Czechoslovakia before the war. Here's a picture. This is a model of what Theresienstadt was like. This is in their museum there now. Here is a mock-up in their museum of what the beds and what a bunk might have looked like. Theresienstadt was considered a privileged camp. This is where the argument between Speer and Eichmann was somewhat helpful, even though Eichmann won. Speer was able to say, but I want my metal Jews protected. And so they were sent to this camp where there was no active killing going on. There were no gas chambers. But if you read the statistics here, of the approximately 140,000 Jews transferred to Theresienstadt, 90,000 were deported to further east to where there were gas chambers, and roughly 33,000 died there themselves just from disease and malnutrition. They were not fed enough. The conditions were really horrible. The mom's reaction when I showed her this picture from the museum was, it was never that clean. And there was more stuff everywhere. It was crowded. Okay, I want to back up and tell you a little bit about this passport that I mentioned earlier. This is what it looked like. So we've got Tutti and Robbie, Heinz and Margaret. This is, there says they're from Paraguay, and this was issued out of Bern, which is in Switzerland. The passport itself, it's different than our passports now because it's got the whole family on the passport, not just one person. And when I asked my mother how she got it, she didn't know. I had written a blog about the passport. And when I did that, I got a reply that said, hello, the man who arranged the false passports was my grandfather. And I'm like, well, who are you? Because I want to know how this passport got arranged. Well, the woman who wrote this was Egbert. Remember our friend Egbert? It was Egbert's granddaughter. And I did some research. I managed to actually visit with the family. This is not the same granddaughter that wrote to me, but another granddaughter. This is Egbert's daughter. This is the granddaughter's husband. I got to find out more about him and about what he did. And he had arranged for the passports with the money that my grandfather had given him back at the beginning of the war. They were able to buy the passports. After another few years, I found out that this was the group of people who actually made these passports. These are diplomats. These three men here are diplomats that were Polish, the Polish ambassador to Switzerland and the men who worked for him, and some Jewish leaders from Poland that happened to be in Switzerland. And they got together and they made passports for between 8,000 and 10,000 Jews that said they were from different South American countries. The passports were not being able to be used for actual travel because the Jews were not given the originals. The Jews were given copies of the passport. And then they were able to, though, show the Nazis that they had papers saying that they were not stateless, that they were belonging to a country that was not involved in the war, and the Nazis better treat them better. So one day, I'm going to go back to Theresienstadt now. I'm going to have Mom, if you can tell the story. A notice came out which said all men between the ages of 16 and 55 were going to be on a transport the next day from Theresienstadt to the east, which included your father.
Right. He had to line up in front of where the trains were standing.
Wait. I'm going to stop you. Before that,
my father, who lived in the men's barracks, came over to the women and children barracks. I happened to be on my top bunk, and he came over and he climbed sort of on the lower bunk and put his arms around me and cried bitter tears and said, "Tutti, I am leaving. I do not think I will see you again. Help your mother, be a good girl. I am being sent to the East." And even at this age, kids know what the East was. So he left, he stood in line, and a gentleman whom he barely knew came over and said, "Aren't you the guy with the Paraguayan passport?" And my father said, "Yes. Look what they did to me. Absolutely nothing. I'm standing in line to get killed." And this man said, "Don't be stupid. Go to the officer in charge and show the passport."
All right. So they showed the passport, and however it happened, this piece of paper was given to my grandfather. Now this says ausgeschieden, which means withdrawn. This number 3911 was Heinz's prisoner number. This was the transport number, his name, and then his birth date. This is very, very thin, what used to be called onion skin paper that people used to use for typing before computers. And he was given this, and this was his ticket for life. He showed the passport, they withdrew him from the transport, and he didn't have to go. That transport went to Auschwitz. I looked up in the archives, that transport was supposed to have 2,500 men on it. And the archives say that 2,499 men arrived in Auschwitz from that transport. One was missing. My grandfather wasn't on. So that passport literally saved him from Auschwitz. Done by this group of men who could have been deported to Poland themselves and sent to Auschwitz if anybody had found out they were forging passports. Okay. Life in Theresienstadt was different than life in Westerbork. Westerbork, the conditions were reasonable. In Theresienstadt, they were not so reasonable. You want to tell some stories about what it was like, washrooms and food lines and things like that?
Everybody had to work in Theresienstadt. My mother had to get up very early to light the wood stoves in the factory where people were working. So she had to get up early. Usually the normal time, normal being 5 o'clock in the morning, the washrooms were overcrowded. She had to leave at 4 o'clock. So she took us to the washrooms at 3 a.m. We had to undress, and in the middle of winter, she washed us with ice cold water, and always believed that if you are hygienic, if you try and keep clean, you have a better chance to survive.
And I saw this picture at the museum in Theresienstadt, and it just reminded me of the story that my mother would tell. And I just imagine that this is Robbie, and this is Margaret, and this is Tutti trying to get washed in the middle of the night. But this painting was done, drawing was done by a 12-year-old girl who survived the war, not related to us.
I had to work in a hospital to bring messages and little packages from one department to the other. But my big job was at 5 o'clock. I had to stand in line, and I had one of those, you can see the picture there of all the women in a row, and they have like containers, and you went by with these containers to where the soup was ladled out for the evening meal. And I was in charge to stand in line, get the soup, walk carefully, and bring it back to the barracks.
Okay. Now I've got a picture here too of my grandfather wearing his ski pants, which are this is a picture from way before the war, but this was the style of ski pants back then. And you can see how they're all bunched up here. And that was very important. Those are the pants he brought with him to stay warm during this winter time. He was given a job in the root cellar, and he was supposed to take care of getting the rotten onions out from the regular onions, because the Germans, the guards, were eating those vegetables, and what went into the soup was the rotten vegetables that weren't good enough for the Germans, like really disgusting, rotten food that didn't have any nutrition left in it. And one day he's at the root cellar, and the guard who's working there supervising him basically looks at him and says, "I'm going to take a break. You're on your own." And my grandfather would take those vegetables, the good ones, stuff them in his pants where it was baggy, run over to the women's side of the camp, give them to my grandmother so that she would have extra food to give to the children and help them survive, because there was not enough nutrition being given out to the Jews. After the war, when I'm doing research, I asked my mother, so who was this guy? Why did he help why did he help my grandfather? And my mother didn't know. But at one point then, she and I were traveling, and we visited an old friend of the family's who said, "Yeah, what about that Nazi SS officer that was a waiter?" And we're like, "What are you talking about?" And so he tells the story that my grandfather had told him. Before the war, my grandfather was a businessman. He traveled a lot, and he stayed in one very fancy hotel in Berlin quite a bit. And he was always very good at tipping, because he wanted good service and he wanted the best table. And the head waiter was somebody he always gave a very good tip to, so he would get that good service. Well, it turned out that head waiter was the SS officer in charge of the root cellar in Theresienstadt. So my grandfather had tipped him well before the war. And while they were in Theresienstadt, the SS officer took care of my grandfather. So I'll sort of let that sink in a little bit. You never know when life is going to come back at you in a way you're not expecting. The family was able to stay in Theresienstadt until the end of the war. This is a picture from Liberation of May of 1945. Liberation was not all that smooth. It was actually, there was a lot of fighting. There was grenades being thrown. There was shooting going on. And then during the actual liberation, the family hid down in the cellar of one of the buildings until it was like all clear and then things calmed down. And then it took about a month of travel. It took about a month before the family was allowed to leave the camp. Even though they were considered free, there was a typhus epidemic going through Europe. They couldn't let anybody out who might be sick, because you don't want sick people to go into the towns where people aren't sick. So just sort of a little bit pandemic-like, got to be careful who's going where. Along the way, when they finally did leave, they were taken care of by some American soldiers. And This guy, Mom, your first crush?
My first crush, my first crush. The American soldiers were walking ahead of my parents and my brother and myself alongside the roadside, and they dropped their cigarette butts. And my father said to my brother, quick, 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 go and pick up the cigarette butts. In those days, we didn't know that smoking was not healthy, and my parents were very happy to have a cigarette butt. And as my
Because they
brother-
smoked it. They smoked the little bit that was left.
So as my brother picked it up, the soldier saw it and said, what's this? And my brother said, oh, for my parents. And they came over and they talked, and my parents and my brother and I spent a fantastic 24 hours with them. They fed us chocolate and oranges and things we hadn't seen in a long time. And they also fed us, they gave my brother and I chewing gum. And my brother said very nicely after a few minutes, that was very good, may I have another one? And the soldier said, another one? You're supposed to chew it. He said, what do you mean? He said, this is chewing gum. Oh, he said, what do the kids do at night with their chewing gum? And he was kidding, the soldier was kidding and told him, American children put it behind their ears when they go to sleep. Well, that's what I did. And the next morning, my mother had to borrow some scissors and I got a slight haircut.
Okay. Okay, so they eventually got back to Amsterdam. And at that point, they had nothing. They had been in the camps for 18 months. Nothing. They just, the clothes on their back, basically, no suitcases, nowhere to live. Their apartments had been taken. Their furniture had been taken. Could you let them know what it was like the first day you got back? What happened? Robert Koch?
Okay. We arrived by train, this time not by cattle cars, but by regular train to the station in Amsterdam. And my father said, you guys stay here. I'm going to go and see where I can get some accommodations for you. He had a very good friend named Robert Koch, whom he had given a lot of his worldly possessions, be it my mother's fur coat or his duffel coat, a lot of stuff. And he called up and he said to him, I am so lucky we made it. We all four made it. We are back here, but we have no place to go. Can we please come and stay over at your house for a day or two? And he said, no, I'm sorry. I have a cocktail party. You're not welcome. Turned out he had collaborated with the Germans, and he was on his way out back to Germany to flee the authorities. And Robbie and I slept on the baggage carts, which were very different from the baggage carts that you find now at the airports. It was more like a big, like a tabletop with wheels that you pushed for your suitcases. And that's where we slept.
And so this Robert Koch had stolen the furniture that my grandparents had given for safekeeping, and he turned out to be a really bad guy. Okay, so at this point, I can keep talking about sort of more concepts about propaganda and genocide, or we can open it up for questions. Sarah, what do you think?
What do you guys want? You wanted to keep sharing more? They want to keep hearing more of your story with your mom.
They want us to just keep talking. Okay.
Keep talking. They're intrigued.
Okay. All right. So the family got back. They got settled in, lived in Amsterdam for a few years. And then in 1950, Heinz was afraid of another war. The Korean War had started, and he was just petrified that the communists were now going to come all the way across Europe from Asia, and they'd be stuck in the middle of war, another war again. So he said, we're getting out of here. We're going to Brazil. So they moved to Brazil. And then in 1953, they finally got permission to move to the United States. Now, the United States had a quota system, which is why a lot of Jews did not get to the United States early in the war years, because the America said, no, we can only allow so many in. In 1953, between 1950 and 53, it was very difficult to get into the US as a refugee. If you were Polish. Now, my grandfather had been born in a town right on the Polish-German border. And so at that time after the war, it was considered Poland. The Polish quota was very high and they couldn't get in. In 1953, the US Congress passed a law that said it didn't have to be the husband's nationality. You could come in under the wife's nationality. And since my grandmother was from Western Germany, they were able to come under the German quota, which was lower, and they made it to the US. By 1958, my mother became naturalized. She got married, 3 children, not in 1958, but afterwards. She's got 7 grandchildren now. Here's a picture from 1967 of the family on vacation, doing much better. All right, I want to look at these statistics. And Sarah, maybe you can have the students go around the room and just call on people to each read one of those squares out loud.
Hey, do you want to start with the blue one?
Of 140,000 Jews in the Netherlands, 107,000 were deported and only 5,000 returned. 4.7%.
Wow. Going to do the orange one below, Alexis?
Only 6 to 11% Jewish children from all of 25 years survived the war.
Riley, you want to do the gray one in the middle?
Of the 140,000 Jews living in the Netherlands at the start of the war, only about 27% survived.
That's you, Logan. Can you see that one?
The green one,
Yes.
only between 4,000 and 6,000 of the Jewish children in the Netherlands.
How about you, Connor, up at the top, the green there?
Overall survival rate, and how do you pronounce that? I don't know how to pronounce
Reisenstadt.
Thank you.
it. Was about 12%.
Delaney? Oh, you get passed. Isaac?
Of the 15,000 children that were in
Reisenstadt.
during the war, only 132, which is less than 1%, are now to have survived.
Wow.
So-
can I pause for just a second? Remember when we read the poem, I Never Saw Another Butterfly? That was from that same camp that she's talking about right now. Okay. Thanks.
We should not be here. My mother's chance of survival was so low. My mother and my uncle are part of this number, 132. Of 15,000 children, 132 survived. Just think about that. You know, 15,000 is like, I don't know,
The town in Vermont.
probably Burlington. I have no idea, you know, but it's like a town, and 132 survive. We shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be able to be telling you the story. And it's also really important for you guys to understand this isn't just a Jewish story. It's not just about what happened to Jews. All of these groups were targeted by the Nazis. 6 million Jews were killed, but millions of others were killed. Polish people were killed just because they were from Poland. People with mental disabilities, people with physical disabilities. If you were lesbian, gay, or bisexual, if you were alcoholic, if you were communist, if you were homeless, you were killed. They didn't want anything to do with you. It was targeted hate.
The Germans wanted to make an Aryan race, blonde, blue-eyed. To them, that was the ideal. And anything that was not that was not good to them.
If it looked different, they didn't want it. If they came from a place they didn't approve of, they didn't want it. If they behaved wrong, they didn't want it. So there's the idea of never forget. We have to be careful. We can't let the past be repeated, even though it's been repeated so many times since the Holocaust. There have been genocides in Guatemala, in Iraq, in Bangladesh, in Darfur, now in Myanmar. It's humans are nasty. They're really mean to each other and they're willing to kill each other. But we have to make that better. We have to question authority when it's starting to target people and do bad things. The Holocaust didn't start with the killing. It started with the propaganda. There were cartoons like this in the news long before there was actual killing. This is in French, and it is equating Jews. Jews are the cause of tuberculosis, syphilis, and cancer. You know, a German export, you know, let's kick the Jews in the butt, get them out of here. This is a children's book called The Poisonous Mushroom, and the poisonous mushroom is the Jew. The Jew will poison our society. We need to get rid of the Jew. Children were being taught to hate from a young age so that when they grew up to be old enough to fight and to kill people, they could just sort of go along with it. This is called the Pyramid of Hate. If you look at the bottom, you start with basic ideas of bias and attitude and stereotyping. And I'm sure you've heard many stereotypes about lots of different groups of people, that certain people are certain ways that are bad. And they're all just glomped in together without any, this is not about reality. This is just a negative view that somebody comes up with and puts out there. And if people start believing it, then they start acting on it, and they can bully and ridicule and call people names, and it's okay to call people by words that are nasty. And then once that becomes normalized in a society, then you start getting discrimination on a more global level. So then discriminating against people in housing and in politics, and then that's we get the like racism that is more systematic in a world. And then you start getting violence. And once you start getting violence, it's very easy to skip to genocide. And so if you let yourself have these things, these attitudes in the blue section, it's just a slippery slope to end up over here. And you need to fight that in your life. You need to not let these things get into your brain and get stuck there, because it's easy to get pushed up the pyramid. We know in all these situations of genocide and war, there are always victims and there's always perpetrators, or those things wouldn't happen. Where we can fight that on a personal basis is at the level of a bystander. There were thousands of people that lived near those camps that knew what was going on the other side of the fence and did nothing. They just let it happen. They turned a blind eye. I don't want to get involved. But we also had rescuers. We had people like those Polish diplomats that were making fake passports. We had people like the waiter that was working for the Nazis. He was a Nazi, but he was helping a Jew steal food for his family. We had people like Egbert who helped hide people and helped getting false papers. That my mother would not have survived without all those rescuer type people involved. It was so important. So if you are ever in a situation where you are seeing bullying and name calling, I'm hoping you don't get to this level ever in your life. But when you see things at this level, be an upstander. Sit with the kid in the cafeteria who everybody teases and be nice to that person. Maybe not this week because we're not sitting in the cafeteria, but you know what I mean. You know, invite the new family in town over, get to know who they are. Include people, find out what is important to them. Because when you get to know people who are different than you realize that they're not so different. Their skin might be another color. Their religion might have different actions. Their accent might be different. They might know another language. But when it comes down to it, everybody wants to know their family's safe. Everybody wants to know there's going to be food on the table for dinner. Everybody wants to know that in northern Vermont, you got enough heat to stay warm. We have the same, everybody has the same wants in life. Doesn't matter what that external stuff is that people over here decide is a bad thing because they're different. Okay, yeah. I'm going to throw it back to you guys now. Questions? Here, a real Holocaust survivor, you must have a question for somebody.
I do. I have a quick
I do
question.
too.
Oh, go ahead, Riley. I'll let you ask first.
When you guys, or when your grandfather gave the money to the guy for him to keep, did you ever end up getting it back?
The question is, did you ever get money back from the?
Yes.
What's
Yeah,
that,
yes.
the doll?
No, Egbert gave, besides the money that he had to give to get the paperwork, the fake papers, he gave everything back to my grandfather. And he even gave him an accounting of where he spent money and what he did with it. And the rest he gave back, which is how we think he basically was able to get back on his feet so quickly after the war and find an apartment to rent and things like that, because Egbert gave money back.
I was interested in hearing about the resources that were placed in secret in the doll's head. Did your family need to use those resources during their time in the camp? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about how Tutti's Promise, the title of your book, kind of came to be.
All right, well, we'll start with what happened to the money in the doll.
What happened to the money in the doll? That is the very big question that we have no answer for. Heidi came and visited me a couple of years ago and said, "Mom, what happened to the money?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "You don't know? Maybe it's still in there." And she took the doll on a big towel, the kitchen counter. I couldn't even watch it. And she took the little knots that my father put in there and opened it and opened the doll, and there was nothing in there. It was cotton wool stuff was in there. We don't know what was in there. We don't know, and I never asked.
It's just a mystery. There was nothing left. My grandfather never said, and now I'm taking the money out, because it was secret. So when he must have gone at some point and used it, but we really don't know when or what he used it for. As far as the title of the book, Tutti's Promise, I actually had a different title. That was my publisher's title, but I don't want to give away. There's two promises in the book that I think are really important. One is that my mom promised to take care of the doll and the money inside it. But there's another promise. And if you want to know that promise, read the book. I'm not giving it away because it's at the end of the book. So.
Other questions? Things you want to know more about?
Even if it's not anything we talked about, I don't know. So, your teacher said you guys were a talkative, inquisitive bunch.
Quiet today.
I'm trying to think of like a good question.
Okay, ask a bad question.
Ask any question. Tutti, have you ever gone back to visit where you grew up?
Did you ever go back to visit?
I didn't go back to visit the camps. I went back to Holland, and I even visited Germany. But I never went back to the camps. I ended up, strangely enough, for a couple of years in Brazil. Are you guys in 11th grade?
11th and 12th grade, yes.
11, okay, that was my age in Brazil. I had to go to a school where I had to learn English and Portuguese at the same time, which was very difficult for me. Spent 2 years in Brazil. then back to Holland, and then finally came to the States. And I had moved my whole life, and I figured, oh my God, how can I stand staying in one town the rest of my life? But it's been wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, when I was a kid, I remember my mother taking, we went on vacation to Amsterdam. She took me to the Anne Frank house when I was probably 12 or 13 years old. The story about the waiter who was the root cellar guard, that story we heard actually in Germany from the friend who was German, that when I was doing research and we went back together.
What
Okay.
is to do with the Anne Frank house?
Riley has another
Never
question.
went back.
Oh, yes, I did see the Anne Frank house, but I didn't go back to the actual camp. A lot of survivors, there are not many anymore, but there were a great number of survivors who did go back, and they visited Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and all the terrible camps. I never had any desire to go
Yeah.
back.
When I was writing Tutti's Promise, I felt like I needed to know what those places were like. I went to Westerbork, I went to Theresienstadt to see what they were like. And I've got to say, visiting Theresienstadt, it was the strangest, most depressing, terrible place it was the worst day of my life. It was just, I was sitting in a restaurant in this town, and I knew the restaurant was in a building that had once been a barracks where people were starving to death. It was just the weirdest, because there's a town there now where people just live, but it was a camp where people were dying. And it's just like this strange juxtaposition. What do you do with this? Does that make sense? Like how bizarre that would feel? It was very weird.
I have a student with a question.
Okay.
Were holidays any different than other days? Or
In the camps?
yeah, in the camps.
Were holidays any different than other days in the camp?
Jews come in various categories, I should say.
Well, observance, how observant they are.
Yes, they are very observant Jews, and they are, how you call it, accumulated Jews. No,
Assimilated.
assimilated Jews. We were very assimilated. When I was young, we celebrated Easter and Christmas and Hanukkah and everything that we could celebrate. But there were people who were very religious, and they celebrated the highest Jewish holiday called Yom Kippur. They celebrated the Jewish New Year.
And they did it in the camps?
In the camps, secretly.
We were just reading Night by Elie Wiesel, and we read a little bit about how, again, it was secretly in the camps as well. So same experience.
That's one of the worst books you can read.
Yeah, that. Yeah.
We have another question, Paige.
What happened to your brother? I think his name was Robbie.
Robbie, what happened to Robbie? Actually, the liberation of the camp was on Robbie's birthday. It was his 7th birthday, and there's actually a really cute story that my mom has told me. What? You don't remember?
Which one?
Okay, so they're liberated from the camp, and I told you that they were hiding in the cellar because there was all kinds of fighting still going on. And when they finally came out, they were liberated by the Russians, okay, not the Americans. And the people were as afraid of the Russians as they were of the Nazis. They had a very terrible reputation of assault and pillage and stealing and doing terrible things. And the Russians are coming down the street, and Robbie stood at the sidewalk and he saluted the Russian tanks going by. And one of the soldiers came off one of the tanks and grabbed Robbie and picked him up and carried him away. And my grandmother was beside herself. She's like, oh my God, we've just survived the Nazis, and now the Russians have taken my son. And there was a period of time where everybody was really scared. And then Robbie came back with this big box of food, that they had given him a box of food, and he brought it back. And Robbie, he settled with, he went through Brazil and back to, Amsterdam and everything else. And he ended up settling in London, and he's had 2 children, and he's not alive any longer, but he had a fairly normal life.
What was very funny, he was always a very a different child. He was always a very rambunctious child. And after the war, during the war, he was taught, when you see food and it doesn't belong to anybody, take it. Don't steal it from people, but wherever you see something that we can use to eat, take it. So when we were in Amsterdam, when we had to walk to school after the war, in Amsterdam, the stores have little displays of the grocery and the cheese guy and the butcher. And he would always come home to my mother, either with a lettuce or a bunch of flowers or a piece of cheese. My mother said, "Where did you get it?" "Oh, it was lying on the outside the store. I took it." So they had to take him and send him to how should I put it?
Reform school.
It was not a reform school. A school where it was very strict, where he had to be taught how to live in a normal setting. But he did trade his winter coat for a candy bar. Yeah.
He had his priorities.
Any last questions? My students are just about to be dismissed. Do you guys have any final questions for Tutti and for Heidi?
If there are any burning questions that people think of later, Sarah, they can always email them to me, or you can either email them for me, to me
Thank
for them.
So much for your time today. We really appreciate it. That was fascinating to get to hear your story.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Have a great afternoon, ladies. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay.